It's done. Jesus is dead. Does the fact that we've all heard this story so many times make it easier to absorb its horror, pain, and loss? Or does it make it harder? Take a moment to put yourself in the shoes of those who were there when it took place. Think first of the disciples who waited with Jesus in the garden, the men who could not keep awake. Were they present at the cross? Mark doesn't tell us. Maybe they were hiding, too frightened to appear, or maybe they were watching from a distance. What were they feeling as the nails were being driven into Jesus? If they were present, they were not only watching the man who they had been following being killed, they were witnessing the very hope on which they had based their lives being ripped out from under them. Were there any among them who had to trust in God deep enough to survive what they saw? Or did they experience only despair? And what of Peter? He had clearly abandoned the others to wander alone through the city. It was then that he had been recognized by the servant girl and denied Jesus. After that, he crept off alone to weep and twist with guilt and remorse. Did his regret finally drive him to the outskirts of the crowd too? Did he stare at Jesus from a distance as he hung on the cross? And what was he feeling? Misery? Shame? Confusion? Self-reproach? Then there was Judas. I can't believe that Judas dared approach the cross. But perhaps he was unable to keep entirely apart. Perhaps he came close enough to hear the roar of the crowd as they cheered when the nails were being driven into Jesus. What could he possibly have been feeling? Was he still trying to think of some justification for what he did? Was he telling himself that he had been right to turn in this man he had been following for so long? That it was Jesus who had betrayed him, not he, Jesus? Betrayed him by not living up to Judas's own expectations of who and what the Messiah was supposed to be? Was he already beginning to regret what he had done? Feeling torn inside? Desperately telling himself that it had been the right thing to do, even as another voice within him began the mounting drumbeat that no, 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 it had been wrong, 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 terribly wrong, that he had made a horrible mistake. And what of Barabbas? He would just have been released from prison as Jesus was being killed. He would be coming out of his dark cell, shielding his eyes from the sunlight, even as he rubbed his wrists that were from where the shackles had left them raw. He would have found the square deserted. The crowd that had filled it in the day before now removed to Golgotha to watch the entertainment. Standing alone there in the public place, would he have wondered about the man who was dying in his stead? Would he have whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude to God for sparing him in this way, for giving him a second chance? Would he have even an inkling of the love that had made this possible? Or had he merely passed it off as just his luck and the other's misfortune? And don't forget the crowd. It was they who had had the final say in the execution. It was they who had pronounced the verdict, and they who had gathered to enjoy the spectacle. They could have freed Jesus, but they did not. Asked by Pilate if they should spare Jesus, they had shouted, "Crucify him!" Pressed by Pilate with a further question, "What evil has he done?" they simply repeated, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And yet, just a few days earlier, these very people had cheered and waved palm branches as Jesus entered Jerusalem. Why such a dramatic reversal? Did they crucify him because they didn't realize that he was the Son of God? Or because they secretly suspected that this was exactly who he was? In other words, had they recognized in Jesus the face of God, and finding God before them in human form, vulnerable and at their mercy, had they lashed out at God for all the ways that life seemed unfair to them, all the times that God had seemed to permit evil to prosper? Was their cry of crucify him an expression of all their ways that they and we reject God at times, never suspecting that God was inviting this response in order to show his love? Did any of them realize this as they watched Jesus die? Or was it only the centurion who did, the foreign oppressor, the one of the hated unbelievers? Truly, this was the Son of God, he said. Was he the only one who saw something deeply divine in the way Jesus embraced not only his end, trusting completely in the God who sent him, but embracing in love all those who condemned him too? Surely there must have been others. Perhaps the women who followed him did. These are the only ones of Jesus' followers who Mark tells us were actually there at the cross. They had, quote, followed Jesus and provided for him when he was in Galilee, unquote. And now they had come in great numbers and were, quote, looking on at a distance, unquote. It was they who were present. It was they who stood to watch. It was they, too, when the time came, who cared for Jesus' broken body, simply going out and doing what needed to be done. Of course they wept. Of course they mourned. And yet they were there. They provided the help required. There must have been trust there too. At some level, they must have suspected that this was not the end, or that even if it was, God was in charge. And given this, there was work to do. Perhaps this is the example we can use to guide us. Whenever there are hard times, perhaps we can remember the women, those most loyal of Jesus's followers. They show us that it's okay not to be okay. They show us that we can do hard things, that we can survive hard times. That's because we can never forget that God is in charge. No matter what happens, God is in charge. And God is with us. Given that, there's nothing we can't survive. Amen.